Hello and welcome to Talking Europe, coming to you from the European Parliament in Brussels. I'm Armen Georgian. What an irony. The man who promised America first and an end to US adventurism in the Middle East struck Syria, while it was Barack Obama, the so-called adventurer, who backed away from military action in Syria in 2013 after a chemical attack there. Donald Trump's actions have blown up any possible rapprochement with Vladimir Putin, or so it would seem, and left Europe in a bind, stuck between the US and Russian presidents. Today we bring you a face-off on the state of the transatlantic relationship between Dutch Green MEP Bas Eickhout. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
Also joining me, Michael Kulbickas. He is a management consultant and the Belgium chair of Republicans Overseas. He was an early supporter of Donald Trump. Welcome to you too.
Thank you very much.
If I could start with you, Michael, do you think that there is a process now of normalizing Donald Trump in Europe, a sort of realpolitik engagement after initial resistance to Donald Trump?
I think certainly that's the case because it's simply reality that most European leaders are going to have to confront. There might be, for domestic purposes, the continued anti-Trump rhetoric, but the reality is that there's a new administration with a new approach, and it behooves both Europeans and Americans to find the best way to work together in a constructive manner because we do have many common goals and common agendas and common interests. And we've always worked together well in the past, and I'm very confident that we will in the future.
Bas, what do you think about that normalization with Trump or not?
Well, in a way, I absolutely agree. We have to work together, so I think there we agree. A normalization with President Trump is still a bit of a difficulty to bring together for the moment, I would say. I don't know exactly where that will go. I would welcome normalization, but like I said, with President Trump, until now, he has been quite unpredictable in many ways. And I think if we talk about Syria, also this attack is a very unpredictable, unprepared one. And of course, the first feeling you could have is, yes, something needs to happen because no one can sit still in what's going on in Syria. But at the same time, bombing an airport and then what? You need to have a strategy. What's next? What are we going to do? There seems to be no strategy at all for the moment. And I think their normalization of getting to a strategy would be very nice to have as well.
No strategy?
Well, I think that there's many things to be said. First of all, it signals an end to the previous administration's passivity in the face of aggression and provocation and crossing of red lines, which were fake red lines. So that era of foreign policy is over. America is reasserting its leadership role. Now, the question of what the strategy is, I am quite certain that there's a strategy. I'm also quite certain that it's much more pragmatic and less ideological in the Obama administration, which was very enamored of its own ideas of leading from behind, as if that was going to somehow lead to people taking on roles that they were not ill-suited to. In the end, I am sure that it is going to be that they have their ideas, but again, unlike in a break with the past, they're not going to telegraph everything they're going to do. And I think that makes it more effective in the end.
Well, that they're not telegraphing it, that's very clear. I'm not going to defend here the Obama administration because I think they made a mistake by calling that a red line and then don't do anything when that red line is crossed. That's not wise policy either. But on the other hand, I just don't know what President Trump wants. It was very clear 1 week before the attack, he was saying removing Assad is not a priority. 1 week later, he's bombing and suddenly Assad is a problem. He was doing everything together with Putin, and now 1 week later he's saying, Putin, you have to choose between Assad or us. It's so inconsistent that, okay, maybe the unpredictability is the strategy, but I think in really building up something in the Middle East, you need to have a strategy. What are you going to do with Iran? How are you going to position yourself towards Russia? Whereas now the strategy seems to be either you're with us or against us. That's not diplomacy.
Well, what we've seen in the past is diplomacy has really failed. For example, the diplomacy to remove the chemical weapons is clearly a failure. Even though it was trumpeted as a big success, it seems that it was all a fake kabuki dance. Everybody
But you don't believe in diplomacy at all? That's a bit of a question.
I never said that.
No, but that's a question I had because you said, well, diplomacy failed. But what do you mean with that?
Well,
in the end, we need to solve it in diplomatic ways.
Yes, but no.
No?
Diplomacy, of course, but diplomacy without the threat of force, of credible threat of force behind it, is meaningless. It's just hot air. It's just talk.
Yeah, but only threatening and only military force is also meaningless.
But that's not what we have.
Well,
we don't have only that. He is a master negotiator, and master negotiators don't tell everything that's in their hand. Just like poker players don't show you their cards. So the fact that he says one thing one day and one thing another day, that does not mean that's exactly the truth, and that's not exactly what he's thinking. But it's certainly, he has the point of view and the experience as a negotiator and achieving in the end the goals he sets for himself. And I think that's what's going to happen.
For me, it is a bit worrying if you compare a world leader that apparently wants to be a world leader again, if you say, well, you have to compare with a poker player. I do recognize the poker player. I don't recognize the world leader yet. Those two things cannot go hand in hand.
Well, I think that you find in the United States and in many other European capitals a difference of opinion on that. In the United States, there's bipartisan support for what he has done. The Democrats and the Republicans and the political establishment in the United States, with very few exceptions, are lauding this move, as saying something had to be done, and you've done something, and it's a good first step.
Until now, it's the only uncontested move in America what Trump did, indeed, and so that probably was also a reason to do it.
Not really true, but indeed.
Well, until now, he was not very much supported by many of the
Does Europe, what should Europe's response be to this? I mean, if this continues, this, you know, as you're putting it, one moment saying this, but then doing something seemingly opposite. Does the EU have any sort of response to that?
The EU should have, and we all know that the EU is always sometimes difficult in getting one line as well, but I think there is one thing where the Europeans are strong in, and that is in diplomacy. And that is in realizing that if we want to really think of what is going to happen next after Assad, and you know, telling we don't want Assad, we don't want ISIS, that's one thing, but what do we want? For example, then you need to negotiate with Iran. Whether you like it or not, the Middle East is a difficult region, and you cannot just say you're with us or you're against us and that's it. You have to think on who are we going to talk to.
I agree with
you have to talk with Russia.
I agree with negotiation, but negotiation does not equal giving the other party everything that he wants and putting force off the table to enforce what your red lines are.
At this moment, we were not even getting people around the table.
And secondly, yes, but okay, and secondly, also, we have seen a lot of talk and not a lot of action. And I'm also a little bit surprised because I would expect
sometimes talk
Europeans,
can be action.
Well,
I always have a bit of feeling that action seems to be only military option.
Well, no.
What do you mean with action?
No.
I would hope that
for example, what we see in the Middle East, we see peace processes without peace processes that go on for decades. It's just talk that achieves nothing. And this is the bottom line, is that the previous approach in which there's talk, and you say that Europeans are very good in diplomacy. Well, what has the European Union achieved in the Middle East in terms of dealing with the Syrian crisis? Precious little.
One area, I want to bring us onto another area which the European Union did play a big role in, and that was the Paris Climate Change Agreement. And this remains, of course, a big, the content, we can say, a bone of contention between Europe and the new US administration. And just before we launch that discussion, I'd like us to have a quick look at this report on Donald Trump's recent executive order on the environment. Let's take a look.
The Clean Power Plan was once the centerpiece of President Obama's fight against climate change and key to the goal of cutting U.S. carbon emissions. It's now the main item on President Trump's environmental chopping block. The far-reaching initiative would have required states to greatly lower emissions from coal-fired power plants, which account for a third of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. But the Clean Power Plan has never been implemented. Legal challenges from coal-friendly Republican states put it on hold last year. Trump's energy independence executive order now paves the way for it to be dismantled. The order also lifts an Obama-era ban on coal leases on federal lands, reverses rules limiting methane emissions from oil and gas production, and asks officials not to consider climate change when making decisions. Missing from the order is mention of the Paris Climate Agreement. Trump promised during his campaign to pull the U.S. out of the deal, but his administration remains divided on the issue. Since entering office in January, Trump has rolled back a slew of Obama-era environmental regulations, including one that barred surface mining companies from polluting waterways. He also approved 2 controversial pipelines that had been halted by Obama. Signing this executive order may have been a first step to dismantling the Clean Power Plan, but in doing so, Donald Trump also signed up for another court battle.
A coalition of 17 U.S. states has already filed a legal challenge to the order.
Bas, what do you think about the future of this climate change agreement? Is it basically over when you see what's going on in the US right now?
No, it's not over. First of all, I think we should not only look in what's going on in Washington, but also look at the different states. And I think the first reactions of a couple of states in the US, including New York and California, has been very clear that they will continue to tackle climate change with their own policies. And these are powerful states as well who can do a lot about environmental legislation. So I think we should not make the mistake by only looking at Washington. Secondly, I think the world reacted quite strongly to announcements of Trump already back in Marrakesh in November last year, where there was a climate summit, where the rest of the world made very clear we will continue with our policies, and the US is part of it or not, but probably it is economically stupid not to be on board of it. And that's probably the most important thing that Trump is promising, as if the coal mines will reopen. Economically, they're not viable. They didn't close because of Obama administration. They were closing already before Obama.
This is really not true, because the Obama administration made it clear that through onerous taxation and regulations, they were going to put them out of business. So it's not that this is a mischaracterization.
You can't deny that coal-fired power plant has gone down in the US over the last 15 years. You know the numbers.
No, I'm not going to get into that, because the point is that...
Because it's a fact.
No, the point is that Obama's policies sought to crush the coal industry based on ideological opposition, allergy to fossil fuels. They felt that fossil fuels are evil, that companies, it's actually driven by an anti-capitalist agenda as well, that oil companies are force for evil in the world, and what they do is evil, and we have to put them out of business.
Wow.
And there's plenty of people who say that. I'm not making up that rhetoric. That's rhetoric which comes from activists on their side.
Can I put some facts on the table? First of all, if he's so much against fossil fuels, explain me why shale gas increased dramatically under Obama. As far as I know, shale gas is also fossil fuel.
Because he's not the emperor. He can't stop everything. He can't do whatever he wants. He couldn't do whatever he wants.
I mean, let's stay to the facts.
No.
What there is there are climate policies needed, or are you also denying climate change?
No, that's a different subject.
Okay,
I don't deny anything.
Okay, good. But then we can start with that we need to do something. That means lowering emissions of CO2.
America does
highest
plenty.
emissions come from
America is one of the
plants.
leaders in technology, but we're not talking about that, because this debate about the Paris Treaty, the Paris Agreement, is not about addressing the problems that the world faces. This is a mischaracterization. This is about anti-democratic means to control resources that people cannot control because they're not theirs to control. What people who promote these kind of agreements seek is to put in place a global infrastructure, spend billions of dollars to regulate economies without the democratic agreement of countries that are subject to these new rules.
I think what you can see here is that it has become such a polarized debate in the United States. That's really a pity, because you know the best thing of Paris is that it has become a bottom-up approach, where countries themselves are pledging plans they do. It's true that before that, in Copenhagen, in the UN, they tried to do a more top-down approach. That has left, that is off. So the idea of a global government,
it's not something.
It's previous century.
Let me explain what I'm thinking. What I am trying to. It's really important that I address this point.
What do you mean with global government?
Because listen. For example, the treaty, the Paris Treaty. It's a treaty. It was not submitted to the Senate as our Constitution requires. This puts requirements on the U.S. economy and on the U.S. people, and it was not agreed by the government of the United States. It was agreed by one man, Obama, who exceeded his constitutional authority. It's an affront to American democracy, and it's an affront to our Constitution. And Donald Trump is only writing a terrible attack on our constitutional order. It's the same thing that President Clinton tried to do with Kyoto when he signed it, knowing that the Senate didn't have a single vote to agree to Kyoto. The American government did not, the American people did not accept Kyoto.
That's why they changed the entire basis of the Paris Agreement, where Kyoto was indeed a reduction percentage that was agreed in Bonn, where the UN Secretariat on Climate Change is, whereas in Paris it's now the countries themselves need to pledge what they're doing.
Why did President Obama not go to the US Senate and present it as a treaty and let them vote on it? Because it would never have passed. Of course it's a treaty.
And therefore he went into the Clean Power Plant, and the Clean Power Plant is just a
No.
It's the way that also in the American Constitution, CO2 is acknowledged as a polluting gas, and then the president has the power to deal with that.
Gentlemen,
that's just how the American law works.
We don't have much time left, but I just want to get back to the bottom line here, basically, because if the US is no longer, let's imagine, a part of the agreement, or if it totally changes its involvement, then basically there's no Paris Agreement. Would you both agree on that? Because the US is simply too important.
The Paris Agreement essentially at bottom is something which is coercive, and it's also predicated on wishful thinking, and also the science is very unsound on that. And I have a scientific background myself, and I often debate with people who have no scientific backgrounds and claim to speak in the name of science.
Yeah,
it's
well,
highly,
my background is
questionable.
Climate scientist, my background is climate scientist, so I happen to know what I'm talking about. Sorry for that.
Well,
and the interesting thing is that if you look at
open inquiry,
the Paris Agreement is not over yet. But it is true, it will become more difficult if the US is not playing its role. But I would like to say is that you now see that a country like China is seeing that climate change policy is also economically wise and delivering the jobs for the future. And I would just advise President Trump to look to the future and create the new jobs, and let's not stuck in the 20th century.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. We could obviously continue much more with this particular theme, but thank you so much to both of my guests, Michael Kulbickas and Bas Eickhout. And don't go away, because the second part of Talking Europe will be back after this short break.